They made him scrub the executive floor in a fake janitor's uniform, on stage, under lights, in front of his peers, just because his skin was black and his presence made them uncomfortable in suits and silence. They laughed while he mopped a floor that had never needed cleaning, clapped when the auctioneer described him as a natural fit for the job, and no one questioned it. Not one voice challenged the spectacle. Not one hand reached to pull him off that stage. He didn't protest. He didn't flinch. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine through the lens of their arrogance, was that the man they mocked had a name that echoed in boardrooms they had never entered, credentials they couldn't match, and a reason for being there that would shatter the illusion of their control. This wasn't just another corporate story about bias swept under the rug. This was the story of a reckoning, slow, surgical, and irreversible. Before you dive in, hit the like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what are your thoughts so far? Let's talk. This isn't fiction for attention. This is a reflection of how power looks away from truth, until truth stares back. The morning sun filtered through the towering glass panels of Callister and Thorne's Manhattan headquarters, casting long streaks of light across the pristine marble floor. The lobby buzzed with polished shoes and the murmurs of early strategy calls as executives sipped espresso and nodded to one another like an elite fraternity. Roman Whitaker entered quietly, a well-tailored navy suit hugging his lean frame, a slim black briefcase in hand, and a calm expression masking the restlessness beneath. He had worked here for 15 months, long enough to know his way around the unspoken rules and quiet power games, but still knew enough to remain unacknowledged at every critical turn. He stepped into the elevator, nodded to the security guard who didn't bother to nod back, and ascended to the 42nd floor, the heart of strategy and corporate development. He had been preparing for this meeting for weeks, compiling data, cross-checking reports, and building a robust presentation that offered actionable solutions for the firm's expansion into the South American market. The room was already filling with vice presidents and senior strategists, all greeting each other by name, exchanging jokes, and claiming seats around the polished conference table. Roman, arriving on time but not early enough, found no seat left. Before he could speak, Charles Denham, the senior director, walked in briskly with two assistants and tossed a dry erase marker onto the table without looking at Roman. With a casual flick of his hand, he motioned toward the whiteboard and said, "You want to help? Start noting key actions." No one raised a brow. No one objected. The marker clattered to the surface, and Roman, standing silently, picked it up and moved to the board. The slide deck he had prepared stayed in his briefcase. He scribbled every half-formed strategy and every vague initiative uttered in the room, reduced from analyst to glorified scribe. His handwriting was neat. His presence was forgotten. The meeting ran 90 minutes. Charles closed it by thanking the team and patting Roman on the shoulder with a tight smile. "Good job taking notes." Everyone chuckled. No one looked at him. Roman offered a slight nod and returned to his desk, his jaw tight. That evening, a high-profile client dinner was held at the Andover Club, an exclusive midtown location with crystal chandeliers and white-glove servers. Roman had helped land the client with analytics that directly influenced their investment strategy. He had RSVP'd early and confirmed with the executive assistant that he was on the guest list. Dressed in a fresh charcoal suit, he arrived early and waited outside, posture upright. Charles arrived moments later, stepping out of a black town car, flanked by senior executives. When he spotted Roman, he paused, smirked, and said, loudly enough for the group, "Didn't know they had valet in a full suit." Laughter followed. Roman didn't respond. He didn't move. He simply smiled with a tightness that didn't reach his eyes. Inside, Charles directed him to the far end of the table, near the waitstaff's entrance. There was no place setting at his seat. He waited until a server hurried over with utensils and a glass. Throughout dinner, Charles spoke at length about innovation and excellence. He praised nearly every member of the team individually, recounting accomplishments, even minor ones, in great detail. Roman's name was never mentioned. The client glanced at him once or twice, confused perhaps, but followed the tone set by the host. When dessert arrived, Charles stood for a toast and raised his glass to those who earned their seat at the table. The others raised their glasses. Roman lifted his, too. He didn't drink from it. The next morning, a congratulatory email thread circulated among the team. Everyone who attended the dinner was thanked. Roman's name didn't appear. He forwarded the email to himself, then archived it. The week continued with small humiliations, each delivered with a smile. On Tuesday, Charles held a partner lunch meeting. Roman was invited not to speak, not to eat, but to assist with documentation. He was handed a yellow legal pad instead of a laptop. When he submitted the typed notes afterward, Charles replied with a thumbs-up emoji. On Wednesday, Roman requested time off. 2 weeks he had saved, approved verbally months before. He submitted the official form. It was denied within an hour. Operational dependency, the note said. The next day, a newer analyst, with less tenure and no open projects, received vacation approval for the same window. On Friday, a company-wide initiative launched, showcasing top rising talent. 20 employees were featured in the internal campaign. Roman wasn't listed. However, his photo, taken months earlier during a group workshop, was used under another analyst's name. He emailed the communications team. They apologized, said it was a template issue, and promised to fix it in the next rotation. There was no next rotation. That afternoon, Charles stopped by Roman's desk with a thick binder. "Take this home," he said. "You're good at cleaning things up." Then he laughed, a short, dry sound, and walked off. Roman took the binder. He didn't speak. That weekend, he sat at his small kitchen table with spreadsheets spread around him, cross-referencing account data, flagging inconsistencies, and preparing a summary memo. He wrote the email Sunday night, but scheduled it to send Monday morning. Charles would send it to the client himself, changing the signature, rewording the introduction slightly, and taking full credit. Roman wouldn't be copied. On Monday, the memo was praised by the client in a call. Charles accepted the praise. Roman listened quietly from the back row. Charles had reviewed the material Friday evening with a dismissive glance and no feedback. On Tuesday morning, Roman entered the room expecting to present his findings. The client team was already seated when he arrived, suits tailored, faces unreadable. Roman adjusted his tie, set his notes on the table, and prepared to connect his laptop. Charles entered behind him, speaking loudly, gesturing for everyone to settle in. Before Roman could begin, Charles pulled him aside and held up a company-branded polo shirt, wrinkled and one size too small. "Wear this. Branding consistency. Everyone's in these today," he said with a clipped tone. Roman looked around the room. Every other team member was in formal business attire. No polos. No casual branding. He stared at the shirt. Charles raised an eyebrow. "It's not optional." Roman took the shirt, stepped into the hallway, and changed. He returned to the room, now visibly out of place. The contrast was immediate. The client glanced at him, confusion flashing for a second before they turned their attention elsewhere. Roman stood by as Charles took over the entire presentation. Roman's name wasn't mentioned. His charts were there, but no credit was given. Charles delivered the financial narrative word for word from Roman's slides, occasionally pausing for questions, and then signaling to others for support. Not Roman. When the meeting ended, Charles clapped him on the back, thanked him for technical prep, and moved on to speak privately with the clients. Roman changed back into his suit in the restroom before returning to his desk, the folded polo shirt stuffed into his satchel. The following day, the department gathered for their quarterly review in the executive conference room, a long mahogany table stretching across a floor-to-ceiling window view of the skyline. Roman sat at the far end, quiet, alert. The performance booklets were distributed, thick packets outlining progress and goals. When he opened his, Roman immediately noticed the cover page featured the title of his project under another associate's name, Bryce Harland, who had joined 3 months ago and hadn't contributed a single dataset to the model. Roman scanned the executive notes. His own contributions were reduced to a sentence, provided background support on analytics. There were no charts, no detailed acknowledgement. Bryce, meanwhile, had a page outlining key innovations and strategic leadership, all describing work Roman had done. Roman didn't speak. During the discussion, Charles introduced Bryce as a rising analyst with tremendous instincts and asked him to walk through the project insights. Bryce stumbled through 3 slides, mispronounced terms, and offered a summary so shallow it was nearly incoherent. Still, Charles nodded proudly and thanked him. Roman sat with his hands folded, biting down on silence. At the end of the meeting, Charles suggested the team gather for a group lunch at a nearby steakhouse. Roman was excluded from the reservation list. When he returned to his desk, there was a sticky note on his screen that read, "Please revise the Harlan deck with updated numbers. Thanks." No signature. No context. He opened the deck and found his original slides rebranded with a new format and name. He worked on the edits, watched the clock, and skipped lunch entirely. That weekend, the company's internal branding team scheduled a photo shoot to refresh their promotional materials for the website and investor packets. Roman received an email with instructions to arrive at 9:30 a.m. sharp for photography. He spent the night polishing his shoes and steaming his blazer, determined to make a strong impression. He arrived early and checked in with the assistant coordinating the session. She looked confused. "You're not on the list," she said, flipping through her clipboard. Roman showed her the email. She nodded slowly and made a call. A few minutes later, Charles arrived, scanning the room. His eyes landed on Roman. "We're going for a certain visual cohesion today," he said vaguely. "Why don't you assist the photographer with lighting adjustments?" Roman stood still for a moment. Then he nodded. He stepped aside as his peers were arranged on high-backed leather chairs in front of a gold-etched wall. Roman stood behind the lens, holding reflectors, adjusting angles, and watching as others smiled into the spotlight. When the final photo was taken, he collected the equipment without speaking. Monday morning, the internet homepage featured a banner, "Meet the Future of Callister and Thorne." A photo of 5 analysts, all smiling, all white, all in suits, filled the screen. Roman recognized the setting, the chairs, even the lighting he had helped position. He wasn't in the frame, not even in the background. That afternoon, Charles hosted a team session to recognize outstanding contributors. Each name was read aloud with applause. Roman's name wasn't called. He became even more punctual, his work even more precise, his demeanor even more neutral. That morning, a calendar invite arrived for the quarterly executive retreat, a mandatory off-site event held at a sprawling estate in Connecticut. It was one of the most anticipated functions of the year, where partnerships were cemented not by work, but by social alignment. The retreat was known for its evening gala, a networking event that separated insiders from those merely employed. Roman confirmed his attendance, bought new cufflinks, and took care to review the weekend itinerary. When the team arrived at the estate, the group was ushered through a rustic wooden hall where name cards were placed on silver trays. Roman's card was missing. A staff member checked twice before handing him a generic guest badge. Inside the welcome lounge, the department was already sipping wine and lounging in leather chairs arranged in a perfect circle. Charles saw Roman enter, offered a brief nod, and turned back to his conversation. No introduction, no invitation to join. Roman found an empty seat near the wall, took a drink of water, and waited until the evening assignments were handed out. For the gala, the executives had organized a casual team-building activity that involved employees serving each other in role reversals. Everyone laughed when Charles announced the theme. "We're flipping the table," he said. "Analysts become servers. Leaders become guests. Let's see who really understands hospitality." Roman was handed an apron. Others received tuxedos. As Roman made rounds with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, several executives mistook him for part of the estate staff. One asked him to refill their drink. Another asked for a napkin. Charles watched, smirked, and said nothing. Later that evening, as photographs were taken for the firm's social media recap, Roman remained behind the camera, not in front of it. He returned to his room after midnight, removed the apron, folded it neatly, and sat in silence. The following week, Roman received a department-wide email announcing the rollout of the new employee directory. He opened the link and scrolled through polished photos and bios. Every team member had a spotlight section, projects led, accolades earned, schools attended. Roman found his name halfway down the list. His profile picture was a placeholder silhouette. His bio was a single sentence: support strategic execution in various capacities. He submitted a correction request through the internal portal. It was marked as low priority. The next day, Charles asked for volunteers to help coordinate logistics for the firm's charity gala. Roman raised his hand, thinking it might offer an opportunity to re-establish visibility. Charles smiled, jotted his name down, and dismissed him without further comment. On the evening of the event, Roman arrived at the venue wearing a freshly pressed tuxedo and prepared to welcome guests. He had assumed he would be stationed at the front entrance or assigned to coordinate presentations. Instead, he found his name listed next to coat check. 2 hours into the evening, Roman stood by racks of winter jackets while his colleagues mingled beneath chandeliers, sipping champagne and trading introductions with city officials and Fortune 500 guests. At one point, an executive dropped off his coat and handed Roman a folded $20 bill. Roman didn't take it. He just stared at the man until he withdrew it awkwardly. Later, a photographer took shots of the gala's highlights. Roman wasn't in any of them. He knew because he checked the photo archive the next morning. Nothing. No trace he had ever been there. The silence deepened in the days that followed. Roman noticed how conversations quieted when he walked into the break room, how colleagues met his greetings with quick nods but no engagement. During team lunches, his seat was often left empty until he arrived. People filled spaces around him without including him. He became an object to avoid, not out of malice, but out of a company's carefully cultivated discomfort with acknowledging someone who did not fit neatly into their unspoken mold. When his name appeared on reports, it was often misspelled. He stopped correcting people. He stopped expecting recognition. One morning, the company unveiled a wall installation featuring portraits of high-performing employees. Each frame contained a quote about leadership and a professionally staged photo. Roman recognized the hallway. He remembered the day the photos were taken. He had adjusted the lighting for most of them. But when he walked down the corridor, his portrait was missing. His quote was nowhere to be seen. His absence was complete. Later that afternoon, Charles hosted a workshop on executive communication. Roman attended, notebook in hand, seated in the back row. During an exercise on body language and presentation, Charles chose 3 volunteers. All white, all male, all visibly inexperienced in public speaking. He called them forward and asked for a real-world comparison. Roman raised his hand, prepared to offer a framework. Charles didn't acknowledge it. Instead, he turned to the group and said, "Let's stick with the regulars. We want consistent energy up here." The group chuckled. Roman lowered his hand and continued taking notes. The workshop ended. He left without speaking to anyone. That weekend, Roman visited the company's internal blog. A featured article titled, "The Culture That Drives Us" spotlighted 10 employees shaping the future of the firm. Each profile described individuals with less experience than Roman, some of whom had joined just months ago. He recognized one profile photo. It was taken on the day he had been asked to assist with lighting. He looked at it for a long time before closing the tab. Monday arrived. Roman came in early, updated the CRM system, finalized client updates, and reviewed market intelligence for the weekly team meeting. He had watched it happen to others in different ways, in different places, but never with the calculated consistency he now experienced. It began with the annual charity auction, a firm-sponsored event meant to raise funds for inner-city educational programs. Participation was technically voluntary, but in practice, everyone contributed something. Charles announced the theme in a department-wide meeting with a booming enthusiasm that barely concealed his condescension. Employees would offer their time or skills as services to be bid on for charity. Some volunteered dance lessons, others cooking sessions, others offered weekend consulting to small businesses. Roman initially didn't volunteer, preferring to remain unnoticed. That changed 2 days later when Charles called him out during a team huddle and said, "Still waiting on your auction item, Roman. Maybe you could show us how to clean spreadsheets faster." Laughter followed, and before Roman could respond, Charles added his name to the sign-up sheet himself. The day of the auction arrived. Roman walked into the central atrium, which had been transformed with streamers, a small stage, and folding chairs set up for company spectators. A table in the back displayed a list of auction items. Roman walked over to find his name beside a humiliating entry: "An afternoon of janitorial service, complete with uniform and mop. Our very own Mr. Clean shows you how to shine under pressure." His chest tightened. He looked around, hoping for a mistake, but Charles caught his eye from across the room and gave him a theatrical thumbs up. Roman said nothing. He didn't have the words, not in a space where laughter had already set the tone. When it was his turn, someone called his name over the microphone. As he stepped forward, an intern handed him a gray janitor's outfit complete with gloves and a fake name tag that read Ron. The crowd howled. Some clapped. Some whistled. Roman took the outfit, walked behind the curtain, and changed. When he returned, dressed in the mock uniform, he stood beneath the stage lights while Charles explained the package in exaggerated praise. "He's got the eye of a detailer and the heart of a housekeeper," Charles announced. "Bid big, folks. You'll never see your floors the same way again." The crowd erupted. Roman stood still, his face unreadable, his eyes dry. The bidding started low, but grew quickly, more out of amusement than charity. When it was over, the winner was a junior associate who whispered to Roman that he didn't mean anything by it. Roman only nodded. He returned to the changing area, folded the uniform carefully, and walked back to his office without touching the food, without speaking to anyone. The next day, Roman arrived to find a printed photo of himself in the janitor outfit taped to his monitor. Across it was scrawled in red marker, "Shining example." Roman took it down, folded it neatly, and slipped it into the bottom drawer of his desk. He said nothing. A few days later, Charles announced a firm-wide branding campaign to modernize the company's image. The campaign involved a new set of promotional materials, including a photo series intended to highlight diversity and innovation. Roman was asked to participate. The request came with a specific instruction. His photo would be taken outside the building, near the sidewalk, where the city skyline provided a contrast to the glass structure behind him. Everyone else had their photos taken inside, near the boardroom, against the executive elevator, or in the penthouse lounge. Roman was the only one instructed to remain on the sidewalk. The photographer tried to make small talk, asked Roman to smile more, tried to angle the shot in ways that avoided reflections of the revolving doors behind him. Roman did as instructed. Later that week, the promotional images went live on the firm's homepage. There were 10 featured employees. 9 posed confidently inside the building, seated, standing beside windows, or gathered around polished tables. Roman stood alone on the street, arms folded, expression serious, with foot traffic blurred behind him. His title was missing from the caption. Only his name remained. Comments filtered in quickly through internal message boards and private emails. Some joked about his photo looking like an Uber driver ad. One email from an unlisted account said, "Looks like they finally let you in from the service entrance." Roman deleted the email. He didn't respond. He didn't ask for a correction. Instead, he forwarded a set of updated analytics to Charles that afternoon. Charles didn't reply. That Friday, Charles conducted a team-building exercise as part of a leadership retreat held at an off-site corporate ranch. The team was split into groups and assigned roles for a simulated survival scenario. Roman was placed in the support crew responsible for gathering materials and setting up camp, while others handled navigation and strategy. During the exercise, Charles assigned him the role of firewood collector and insisted he wear a reflective vest to ensure visibility. The team laughed again. Roman wore the vest. He gathered wood. He kept his head down. At lunch, a joke circulated about forming a cleaning crew named Whitaker and Shine. Charles overheard and added, "Hey, don't knock it. He's got range." When the event concluded, Roman rode in the back seat of the company shuttle, while others shared stories and inside jokes. He stared out the window, watching the blur of trees pass in silence. On Monday morning, Charles called a department-wide meeting to review performance metrics and future initiatives. He began by praising several team members for their commitment and agility. When he reached Roman, he paused and grinned. "Let's not forget our most versatile player, analyst by day, mop wrangler by night." More laughter. Roman nodded. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. After the meeting, no one approached him. No one asked if he was all right. The silence was no longer awkward, it was expected. He had been positioned. His value reduced to a running joke. His professionalism recast as irony. His identity transformed into a spectacle for others' amusement. He existed in a space where respect was transactional, and his account had been emptied. Tasks he'd previously owned began to disappear from his calendar without explanation. Files he had carefully prepared and archived were replaced with outdated versions. When he asked the operations coordinator about missing documents from a shared drive, she replied that she had only received what was forwarded by Charles. Roman said nothing, but noted the timestamps and the email trails. He wasn't imagining things. His access to sensitive project folders had been reduced without notice, and on Wednesday, a notification pinged his inbox informing him that his system permissions had been reclassified under a different user level. He requested clarification from IT, but no one could give him a straight answer. Roman didn't push. He understood how things worked here. Aggression was a weapon afforded only to those in power, and power didn't look like him. Late that evening, after most of the office had cleared out, Roman stayed behind to finalize a proposal for a multinational retail client. He had worked on the forecasting model for weeks, gathering data from multiple regions and building a comprehensive risk assessment. The report was due for internal review by Thursday morning, and Roman had made sure every line, every calculation, and every projection was vetted and precise. At 10:30 p.m., he saved the file to a secure internal folder, double-checked the permissions, and left the office. He didn't know that someone would access the folder within the hour and replace the final version with an earlier, unpolished draft riddled with outdated figures. The following morning, Charles opened the report during the executive review and flipped through the pages with exaggerated disapproval. He scanned the room, then looked at Roman with a frown. "These numbers aren't aligned with our Q3 revisions," he said slowly. "Who approved this version?" Roman, seated near the back, replied evenly that he had uploaded the most current version the night before. Charles raised an eyebrow and shook his head. "We'll need to revisit this. Let's not let things slip through the cracks again." The room shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke in Roman's defense. The review moved on. Afterward, Charles didn't speak to Roman directly. Instead, an email arrived from Charles's assistant requesting Roman to draft a follow-up deck by Friday morning with revisions. No mention of the sabotage. No inquiry into the discrepancy. That Friday, Roman submitted the updated deck, but when the leadership packet went to print, his name was omitted from the author section. Bryce Harlan's name appeared instead. Roman opened the PDF twice, then closed it without comment. The next blow came unexpectedly. Roman had submitted a vacation request months ago, 10 business days during the winter holiday season. He had coordinated timelines, covered client handovers, and secured approvals from his immediate supervisor. It was the first time he had formally requested time off since joining the firm. When he followed up for confirmation, he received a curt message from HR stating that due to overlapping department needs, his request had been denied. When he asked who had approved overlapping requests, he learned that Bryce and another associate had both been granted leave for the same period. Roman forwarded his original email thread. There was no response. 2 days later, Bryce mentioned his trip to Aspen in the hallway. Roman nodded without speaking. In the same week, Roman discovered that a confidential memo he had drafted for internal compliance regarding risk flagging had been distributed to department heads, with his name stripped out and Charles's comments appended in bold. Worse, someone had inserted mocking annotations throughout the file, sarcastic questions, jokes about methodology, even a poorly edited image embedded in the appendix showing Roman's head photoshopped onto a cartoon detective. The file had circulated among 5 departments before it was pulled. Roman learned about it through a junior analyst who apologized profusely when he mentioned it. "I didn't know you hadn't approved it," she said. "I thought it was internal humor or something." Roman didn't respond. He simply logged the incident. That night, Roman stayed in the office past midnight, cleaning his folders, backing up his work, and encrypting the latest client data under a private subfolder. He stopped saving things to shared drives. He stopped trusting anyone with edit access. At that point, he realized this wasn't just neglect or oversight. This was strategic dismantling, a coordinated erasure of credibility, designed not to destroy him in one sweep, but to carve him away piece by piece. On Monday, he arrived early to find a new team member seated at a desk adjacent to his, logging into a terminal Roman had previously used. There had been no announcement. When he inquired with HR, he was told that due to shifting departmental structures, his desk location had been changed. He wasn't relocated to another seat among his peers. Instead, he was placed beside the printer room, facing away from the floor-to-ceiling windows. His nameplate was missing. Later that week, he was asked to train the new hire on a client platform that Roman had designed 3 quarters ago. During the session, Charles stopped by, asked a few trivial questions, then complimented the new hire's strong grasp of infrastructure. Roman didn't speak. He clicked through the onboarding slides and ended the session 15 minutes early. By Thursday, he was no longer included in the regular strategy syncs. He had to request the meeting notes from junior analysts. His access to the team dashboard had been revoked. He was asked instead to focus on ad hoc deliverables. The phrase stuck in his mind: ad hoc, disposable, temporary. On Friday, the department gathered for a town hall. Roman didn't plan to attend, but an assistant stopped by his desk and said Charles had mentioned all analysts should be present. The meeting was held in the open lounge on the 43rd floor, where soft lighting and curated music made the gathering feel more like a cocktail hour than a performance review. Charles stood at the center, holding a tablet, calling out names and thanking employees for their contributions. His name appeared less and less on distribution lists, and when it did, it was often buried beneath others, always without comment. The first sign that something different was coming appeared in the form of a last-minute email from Charles, sent just before lunch, instructing Roman to prepare an updated risk analysis deck for an upcoming board review. The catch: it had to be completed and delivered by end of day, and it required access to datasets that Roman no longer had permissions for. When he requested temporary clearance from the data team, they told him authorization had to come from Charles. Charles never responded. Roman tried again, leaving a voicemail and sending a follow-up message, but hours passed without a reply. By 3 p.m., the deadline loomed. Roman improvised by scraping together archived data, working with outdated sheets, and double-checking every calculation manually. At 4:55 p.m., he uploaded the deck and sent the file to Charles, clearly marked draft limited data. 10 minutes later, he received a reply, not from Charles, but from a managing director. The message was curt, stating that the file had been forwarded prematurely and was being reviewed under the assumption it was final. Roman stared at the screen, heart frozen, as a follow-up email arrived with multiple executives copied. It outlined discrepancies in the risk forecast and questioned the accuracy of the analysis. Charles replied last. His tone was detached, disappointed, and brief. "This is below our standard. I expect better diligence next time." Roman sat motionless, his fingers still hovering above the keyboard. Not one word in his defense. No mention of the blocked access, no clarification of context. The blame had been dropped cleanly on his shoulders, and the inbox was silent once more. That night, Roman didn't leave the office until well after dark. The janitorial staff entered before he finished clearing his desktop. He didn't speak to them. He didn't speak to anyone. He walked out into the cold air of the city with a blank expression and no destination. The next morning, Roman's badge failed to unlock the elevator to the strategy floor. He tried again. Same result. a security guard passing by asked if he needed assistance. Roman said he worked in strategy. The guard made a call, then escorted him to a temporary desk on a lower floor, claiming it was part of a seating reallocation that had not yet been publicly announced. The desk was wedged between a pillar and the copy machine. No phone line, no privacy, no view. Roman said nothing. He logged in and began replying to emails that no one would read. He was now officially part of a team without a function. By midweek, the final insult arrived not in a meeting, not in a memo, but in the form of a department newsletter. Roman opened it out of habit and saw his name listed at the bottom of a section titled Staff Support. The description read, General Assistance and Overflow Support, available upon request. That was it. No mention of his background, his strategic role, his tenure, or the dozens of presentations he had once led. He had been relegated to a line item, a utility with no specific identity. The following day, Charles passed Roman's new desk without stopping. He paused briefly, as if about to speak, then looked away and continued down the hall. Roman watched him go, his gaze steady, unblinking. It was the first time he didn't feel anger, not even sadness, just quiet detachment, the kind that comes after too many blows to the same place. That afternoon, during a departmental presentation, Roman joined the meeting virtually, his camera off, his name reduced to a blank square in the corner of the screen. He listened as Charles presented a case study Roman had created over 2 months of analysis, now rebranded under another associate's initials. No acknowledgement, no citation. When Charles was asked a question about one of the variables, he stumbled, offered a vague response, then moved on. Roman muted his mic. He left the meeting early. That night, Roman returned home to find a letter in his mailbox. It was from the firm's compliance division, informing him that an internal review had flagged inconsistencies in timekeeping logs and data access, and that a formal inquiry had been opened into his usage patterns. It was a setup. He knew it instantly. There were no inconsistencies, only access barriers and deliberate omissions. But there was no point in fighting back. Not yet. Not without clarity. Not without purpose. Roman filed the letter in a folder marked Hold and sat at his kitchen table for a long time, unmoving. He did not cry. He did not call anyone. The silence had become familiar. The next morning, Roman arrived early. The building was nearly empty. He took the elevator to the executive floor using a visitor badge and stood in the hallway outside the boardroom. He wasn't scheduled for a meeting, wasn't on the calendar, but he watched the silhouettes moving behind the frosted glass. He watched as people who had taken his work and his credit and his time laughed, collaborated, shook hands. He stood there for 5 minutes, maybe 10, before turning away. He didn't know what he was waiting for. He had documented more than they realized. And now, from that place of forced invisibility, he began to construct a mirror, not to reflect himself, but to reflect them. The first move was small. He logged into a secure, off-site data vault he had quietly maintained since the first time one of his slides had been stolen. He cross-referenced timestamps, metadata, and revision histories of decks, memos, forecasts, and dashboards. Every manipulation of authorship, every file renamed and republished, every instance of cut-and-paste sabotage. It was all there. He had tracked it not out of paranoia, but out of necessity. Over 200 documents had passed through his hands and been stripped of credit, misattributed, or altered without approval. He compiled the evidence, noting patterns. Same names, same time windows, same internal pathways. He knew the project numbers, the email chains, even the shadow folders hidden in the shared drives. Then came the conversations. Roman had no recordings, no transcripts, but he had emails, Slack messages, and printed remarks that skirted policy while weaving a clear picture of bias and systemic exclusion. Comments about his demeanor, his lack of cultural fit, his neutral energy. There were notes from performance reviews that contradicted project outcomes, mentorship promises that had never materialized, feedback cycles that skipped him entirely. He began to thread these moments into a timeline. Day by day, quarter by quarter, He built a structured, clinical narrative of how a high-performing employee had been systematically erased by the very institution that had once championed diversity in its annual reports. He gave the file a name, Contingency Alpha. Then, for the first time since his demotion, he called someone. It wasn't HR. It wasn't a lawyer. It was someone from his past, a woman named Shauna McRae, a senior investigator in the Equal Employment Division of the Department of Labor. Roman had met her years ago at a conference on workplace ethics when he was still in grad school. They had exchanged emails once or twice over the years, more out of mutual respect than friendship. This time, his message was different. He outlined the scope of what he had endured and attached 3 preliminary files. She called back in 24 hours. The call was short. She asked only one question. Do you want to go public or go surgical? Roman didn't hesitate. Surgical, he said. Over the next week, Shauna began the formal process of inquiry. She requested access, reached out to contacts, began a quiet assessment of internal operations at Callister and Thorne. Roman returned to the office the following Monday. No announcement, no explanation. He wore the same suit he'd worn on his first day, navy wool, narrow lapels, black tie. He didn't sit at his old desk. He didn't log into the system. He went straight to the atrium where Charles was leading a new employee orientation. Charles spotted him and hesitated for half a beat before offering his usual smirk. Didn't know you were scheduled, he said loud enough for the crowd to hear. Roman smiled, polite but unreadable. Just observing. He stood in the back for the entire session. Took notes. Watched. Said nothing. That afternoon, 3 emails were sent from the Office of Corporate Compliance. They were marked private and urgent. They triggered small meetings behind closed doors, hushed voices, an unusual quiet across the floor. By Tuesday, Roman noticed a shift in the air. People looked at him but didn't speak. The same managers who used to walk past without acknowledging him now nodded curtly, eyes cautious. He was no longer invisible. He was something else now, an unknown variable. Wednesday morning brought another escalation. Shauna's office had issued a formal request for personnel records and internal review procedures related to promotion, evaluation, and complaint management over the past 24 months. Charles received the request first. His assistant forwarded it up the chain. Legal got involved by noon. Roman sat at his desk by the printer, typing quietly. No one disturbed him. No jokes. No assignments. No requests. He began re-uploading clean versions of the stolen reports, each marked with metadata, version history, and a new footer that read Original Contributor, R. Whitaker. It was not a confrontation. It was a correction. By Thursday, someone removed the photo of him in the janitor's outfit from the office bulletin board. No one mentioned it. No apology. But Roman noticed. On Friday, the senior leadership team called a closed-door emergency meeting. Roman wasn't invited. Eyes lingered. Conversations paused. He took the elevator to the executive floor, not the analyst tier or the overflow suites, but the top level where polished floors echoed and doors remained closed unless summoned. He did not wait to be summoned. His calendar invite with the chief people officer and the VP of ethics and compliance had not been canceled. That in itself was a shift. The conference room was quiet when he arrived, a paneled interior with understated lighting and a large, round table surrounded by empty chairs. He sat down, placed a slim folder on the table, and waited. At precisely 9, the door opened. Alana Gibbs entered first, Chief People Officer, her heels tapping softly against the tile, followed by Daniel Reese, VP of Ethics. Both greeted him with polite, professional expressions, no small talk, no ceremony. The room settled into silence as Roman opened the folder and began to speak. He did not raise his voice. He did not dramatize the contents. He explained the trajectory of his time at the firm, how he had been recruited for his analytical acumen, assigned critical projects, and consistently delivered results beyond expectation. He laid out the evidence of authorship theft, sabotage, discriminatory treatment, and the strategic isolation that followed. He did not accuse. He demonstrated. Every claim was backed with data, file versions, timestamps, email threads. The folder contained 3 internal memos printed on letterhead, each annotated to show where original content had been stripped or reattributed. His tone remained controlled, devoid of emotion, but beneath it was an unmistakable undertow of precision and power. When he finished, he placed a second document on the table, a letter from the Department of Labor acknowledging receipt of a formal complaint filed under the Workplace Discrimination and Retaliation Act. He did not threaten. He informed. Alana and Daniel said nothing for a moment. Then Alana leaned forward and asked a single question. "Why didn't you escalate this sooner?" Roman looked directly at her and replied, "Because I wanted to be certain they were willing to burn the bridge." He didn't need to say who they were. She understood. Daniel nodded slowly, murmuring that they would be initiating an internal audit and that he would be looped into the review process. Roman nodded once, rose from his seat, and left the room without looking back. That afternoon, an unusual flurry of movement stirred through the executive corridors. Charles was called into a meeting. His assistant received a call from legal. A document titled Preliminary Internal Findings was pulled into a restricted access folder. Roman did not attend the usual meetings that day. He didn't need to. He had already spoken in the one room that mattered. By Wednesday, more employees had begun whispering about the investigation. The department buzzed with quiet tension. Slack messages were oddly formal. Meeting invites were suddenly triple-checked. Charles remained outwardly calm, but Roman noticed a change: less banter, more silence, longer periods behind closed doors. That same day, Roman received a request from Internal Communications to confirm the accuracy of his employee profile and role description for the updated company directory. He returned the request with a clean copy that outlined his real contributions over the past 18 months, listing every project, every client impact, and every metric he had built. He included no embellishments, only the truth. That night, the company intranet updated. Under Strategy Associates, Roman's profile now appeared between Bryce Harland and another mid-level analyst. His photo had been restored. His bio was updated. His job title was listed as Lead Strategic Analyst Global Accounts. It was the role he had earned a year ago, but had never been given. The firm didn't issue an announcement, but everyone saw it. The next morning, Roman entered the office and was greeted not with applause or cheers, but silence, a different kind this time, one filled with restrained acknowledgement. A few nodded. One junior associate muttered, "Glad you're back where you belong." Roman offered a brief smile, not in celebration, but in confirmation. Later that day, an executive luncheon was held in one of the upper lounges. Roman's name was on the invitation, not added as an afterthought, not handwritten or orally passed along, but printed in block letters alongside department leads. He attended. He sat at the main table. No one joked. No one made snide remarks. Charles sat 3 seats away, avoiding eye contact. Roman listened quietly, spoke when prompted, and did not gloat. That evening, as the office emptied, Charles approached Roman near the elevator bay. There was a pause, an awkward stillness, as if words were fighting to surface, but couldn't find traction. Roman didn't flinch. He didn't step aside. He waited. Charles eventually said, "I didn't see it going this way." Charles kept walking, pretending not to feel the shift that had already begun to solidify. Over the weekend, the internal audit team had conducted preliminary interviews with 5 members of the strategy department. Those conversations were documented, time-stamped, and cross-referenced with digital records. Roman's presentations, emails, Slack logs, project submissions, and metadata from files recovered from the firm's backup archives. The findings were as damning as they were precise. Not only had Charles repeatedly taken credit for Roman's work, but he had also manipulated file histories, rerouted emails, and blocked access privileges during critical submission windows. On top of that, several documented incidents of public ridicule, including the charity auction and the photo discrimination, were now classified by the legal team as targeted workplace misconduct. That morning, HR and legal held a closed-door meeting on the 44th floor. Roman was not present, but Shauna McRae's agency was. The firm had no choice but to open a formal grievance hearing. There was no way to bury it. The evidence was too clear and the implications too wide. Charles had not just humiliated a single staffer. He had endangered the firm's compliance integrity during a time of regulatory review. The executive board was furious. Investors had started asking questions after Shauna's agency sent preliminary notices to third-party compliance bodies. The board couldn't protect Charles without risking their reputation, so they made their decision. By Wednesday, Charles's calendar was blank. His assistant had been reassigned. Office doors that had always stood open were now closed. When the leadership newsletter went out Thursday afternoon, a new name appeared under Strategic Division Oversight, Interim, Margaretson. There was no mention of Charles, not even in the footnotes. The firm didn't release a formal termination statement, but internally, everyone knew. He was done. The next morning, Charles arrived early, hoping to salvage whatever remained of his role, his dignity, or at least his narrative. But his keycard access had been reduced. He was allowed entry to the building, but not to the executive floor, not to the analytics suite, not to his private server drive. He sat in an empty client lounge for an hour before being escorted to HR. The meeting was brief. It was not a negotiation. They presented him with an agreement, a non-disclosure clause, and an option: resign with separation terms or be terminated for cause pending legal review. Charles took the offer. He signed. He left. No farewell email. No closing remarks. No last team huddle. He walked out with a single leather briefcase and a firm-branded umbrella. The man who had once controlled the rhythm of an entire department exited under fluorescent lights and indifference. Roman didn't watch him leave. He had no interest in victory laps. Justice wasn't theatrical. It was factual. Later that week, Roman attended a strategic planning session with the new interim lead. Margaret had already heard about his work, this time not through whispers or filtered summaries, but through the evidence submitted during the review. She introduced him not with hesitation, but with clarity. The analyst whose data integrity had restored a fractured account and whose documentation had identified procedural gaps in firm governance. After the meeting, she asked him to take point on a restructuring initiative involving diversity pipeline recalibration. Roman accepted the responsibility without pride, without ceremony. He understood the work had only begun. He also knew that performance wasn't enough on its own. Not anymore. By Friday, the firm's internal newsletter issued a note about ethical realignment and structural change, citing the importance of equitable leadership and the role of accountability in sustainable culture. It didn't name names. It didn't need to. The message was clear. For the first time in years, the culture began to shift away from hollow slogans and selective spotlights. Roman noticed the change in tone during meetings. People paused before speaking. They credited others without being prompted. They asked questions instead of performing certainty. A junior associate who had once laughed along with Charles now led a roundtable on psychological safety in fast-paced teams. Roman was asked to mentor two incoming analysts, not because he was the safe choice, but because he was the right one. He accepted, not out of duty, but because the weight of being unseen had taught him how to make others visible. Across the city, Charles tried to schedule meetings with consulting firms and private equity groups, but the calls were slow to return. Word had already moved through professional channels, not through gossip, but through pattern recognition. His name was associated with fallout, not foresight. He attended a panel discussion 2 weeks later on executive resilience, but he was seated in the audience, not on stage. When he introduced himself to a managing director afterward, the man nodded politely and said he had heard of him, but didn't elaborate. Charles smiled thinly and moved on. The weeks that followed were quiet, not with the forced silence of suppression, but with the kind of reflective calm that settles in after a storm has finally passed. Roman's days no longer started with anxiety or ended in the residue of humiliation. He arrived at the office not as an exception or a tolerated presence, but as a recognized contributor. And though there was no parade, no public apology, the shift was undeniable. When he walked into a meeting room now, people listened. When he offered insight, they documented it. Not because he demanded attention, but because truth, once revealed, cannot be easily ignored again. The firm had begun to rebuild its image from within, abandoning its performative gestures, and instead focusing on the structures that allowed harm to flourish silently for so long. It wasn't fast, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. New committees were formed, not just for diversity, but for accountability. Anonymous reporting was no longer seen as a threat, but embraced as a safeguard. The quarterly review panels were restructured to include peer feedback, and the firm began consulting external experts to implement ethical training that didn't just tick boxes, but confronted the roots of unconscious bias and institutional arrogance. Roman had no desire to lead these changes publicly, but he remained present in every conversation that shaped them. His resilience had become the blueprint, not through speeches or campaigns, but through the example of surviving, documenting, and holding ground in the face of erasure. And then, unexpectedly, Charles returned, not to the office, but in a different space entirely. It was at a public ethics symposium hosted by a regional university, an event featuring professionals who had once fallen from corporate grace and were now advocating for structural reform. Roman had not known Charles would be speaking. He had attended the conference by invitation, having submitted a paper on restorative integrity in post-crisis corporate cultures. When he entered the hall, Charles was already on stage, speaking not with charm or bravado, but with something closer to humility. He described how he had mistaken performance for leadership, control for strategy, and popularity for credibility. He didn't excuse what he had done. He didn't name Roman, but he admitted to having built a system that elevated himself by minimizing others, and he explained how the collapse of that system forced him to confront the emptiness at its core. Roman listened, not with sympathy, but with attention. After the session, there was a reception. Charles approached him. There was no crowd, no audience, just the two of them, standing near a table of untouched hors d'oeuvres. Charles looked different, older, not in age, but in presence. Gone was the smirk, the smug posture, the knowing wink. He extended a hand. Roman shook it. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Charles said he was trying to do better. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't offer excuses. He simply acknowledged the truth of what had been. Roman replied that growth wasn't about becoming someone new, but about facing who you had chosen to be. Charles nodded once. They parted without ceremony. That moment didn't erase the damage, and it didn't rewrite the past, but it marked the first honest step Charles had taken. It wasn't redemption in the theatrical sense. It was accountability made visible. Back at the firm, Roman continued to evolve, not into a symbol or a martyr, but into a steward of integrity. He built mentoring programs, not just for recruitment, but for retention. He reviewed policies, not just for compliance, but for clarity. And he reminded the new hires, in his quiet, even tone, that justice wasn't an event, it was a process. One that required consistency, courage, and the discipline to hold truth even when it's uncomfortable. Employees who had once been silent now spoke more freely. A culture that had been built on hierarchy and favoritism began to shift toward inclusion and transparency, not through branding or slogans, but through policies and behavior that reinforced them. The firm still faced challenges. No institution changes overnight, but the foundation had been cracked, the flaws exposed, and that vulnerability had allowed honesty to enter. Roman never sought revenge. He never aimed to destroy anyone. He simply wanted to be seen for who he was, for what he had contributed, and for what he had endured without compromise. In the end, he was. And that recognition wasn't just his to hold. It rippled outward, shaping the paths of those who came after him. He watched as young analysts of color walked into meetings with confidence, knowing someone had already forced the door open. He saw how managers now paused before dismissing a suggestion, how performance evaluations now included team feedback, and how casual jokes once laughed off were now challenged by peers without fear. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And progress, Roman knew, is built not on slogans or apologies, but on a sustained refusal to let silence dictate truth. On a clear Friday morning, nearly a year after the audit had begun, Roman stood at the edge of the firm's rooftop garden, looking out over the skyline that had once made him feel small. Now, it looked different. Not because the city had changed, but because he had. He had reclaimed space, not with vengeance, but with presence. He had become undeniable not by shouting, but by enduring. And in doing so, he had reminded an entire institution that justice is not loud, but it is unrelenting. The message at the end of it all was simple, but profound. Power is not in titles or positions, but in the courage to speak truth, to resist invisibility, and to demand dignity, not just for yourself, but for those who come after you. The end. If you're still here, thanks for reading this far. If the story resonated with you, consider giving it a like and subscribing. It helps get more eyes on stories that matter. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the plot? Did any moment hit you harder than expected? And where are you watching or reading from? Drop a comment and let's talk. Your feedback keeps these narratives going.